Yeah, you like it?
Oh, I can take this off.
And make sure this is
Right
talking
here?
to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Down.
Sorry, guys. I like to make things awkward. So I do. It's true. It's my gift. When God gives you a spiritual gift, you don't ask questions why. You just use it. You know what I wish, because what I like about when we have midweeks is actually being able to like share good news and this is what's going on, but I haven't figured out how to do that with this group and then with this group. So I gotta get creative, because as long as we're doing split duos, I'm sorry that we're just jumping in, because it feels like we're just jumping in. And I'm sorry that you guys want me to jump in because you've already been sitting here like staring at the computer waiting for something to happen. So we're just gonna jump in. I got a little lesson, and then we're gonna have D groups here. We'll break up into smaller groups, and then we'll break you guys into smaller groups. And don't leave. If something's prompting you to leave when we break up into smaller groups, we've decided it's not the Spirit. So stay and talk, and let's discuss with one another. So really that's where I think the power comes in what we're doing tonight. But I also had said about 2 months ago, I think it was the first time we got together, that we're gonna have a series of teaching about the women's role. And as we've been dissecting this, Glenn Giles is gonna like do something scholarly. He's going to give us some meat on the bones. We are still figuring out what to, like, we haven't forgotten about that. Okay. I just want to say that we don't have the dates. We're almost pinned down the dates when we're going to do that. But I just throw that out there so you don't think I lied to pretend. The lights went on just really bright right there. So you don't think that we were lying. We actually are still in the process of doing that. So we'll get something communicated to you. But so what we decided to do in our monthly times together is just dive in and look at some of the women in the Bible, right? And why are we doing this? One of the main points that I want us to take away is really grasping on the fact that the women that we look at in the scriptures and that we admire and that we talk about and that we want to be like, they were women just like us, right? They lived lives just like we did. I think it's too easy for us to kind of ascribe these supernatural powers, like they just had this holy thing going on and they just floated on clouds. But then we lose the role that their choices and their wrestling and their failures and the refining that God was doing in their lives had on them when we just flatten them out like that, you know? Have you ever felt dismissed by people that maybe perceive that you have it easy in some area? This is a young crowd, so most of you aren't moms, but if you're a mom, absolutely this happened, because maybe someone caught you on a day where your kids were behaving. They saw you on that one day, and they say something like, oh, you are so lucky, your kids are so well behaved and they just are so compliant. And they say, and well, yes, there's different temperaments and different kinds. It just dismisses the fact that no, there's been blood and sweat and tears put into this to try to get these kids to act like humans at different points, you know? But I think we often approach the people in the Bible in the same way. We do that to them where we're like, wow, it must have been so easy for them, or boy, they must have just been so gifted. And we then remove our ability to actually learn from them, to actually take their story and make it our own and grasp from it. They remain wholly other at that point. And nobody in the scriptures was wholly other, right? Even Jesus was a man. The Bible makes a point to say he was completely like us. And so that's what we want to do. We want to look at these women and kind of pull out and flesh them out a little bit, put some meat on their bones and look at their stories. Remember last month we talked about Esther, right? And how Esther was a woman. She wasn't like especially equipped. She was beautiful. That's what she had going for her. She was beautiful, lovely in form and feature, okay? But she didn't have this special pipeline to God. You know, she wasn't like born spiritual or something. She had to make a choice about whether or not she was going to consider others and their needs ahead of her own, right? The same thing happens to us, right? I think sometimes because the fate of an entire people don't necessarily rest on that choice, but we forget the fact that we sit there and we make the same choices. We have to wrestle. I'm sure if you all take a second and think, what was a choice you had to make today between putting someone or yourself first? We all had a choice like that today. You know, some of us had more significant choices to make like that. Some of us had less, but we all have it's the same building blocks that our sister Esther faced in the scriptures, right? And then what about Sarah? Again, Sarah was a woman just like you and I. I'm going to say that so many times tonight, you're going to get sick of it. She had to learn to choose to trust her husband when he was on a spiritual high and when he was on a spiritual low. AKA, hey, can you tell the king that you're my sister and then go live in his harem? Spiritual low. Okay, my husband's probably had some weak points in our life. Never that. Okay, but she had to learn. Is she gonna trust him? What do you do if you're married? What do you do when your husband's not firing on all cylinders? How do you handle it? What do you do with it? Just like Sarah, we have to make those same choices. I also think it's pretty interesting that where you see her cynicism come out, it's not in those two instances where Abraham said, go live with that king so I can survive. Where her cynicism comes out is when God said, you're going to have a son. And she got, why? Because that's, I think, probably the place of her deepest hurt, her deepest wound. That's where her cynicism came out. And you know where my cynicism comes out? In the places of my deepest hurts, in the places of my deepest wound. She was a woman just like us, or even Hagar, right? Hagar had so thoroughly lost hope in her son having a future that it says she took him out into the desert, and literally it says she put him under a tree and she walked away because it says, I cannot watch the boy die, right? And I think metaphorically speaking, I'm sure there's some of us tonight that are wrestling with distancing our own hearts from our kids because we don't want to watch them die, right? Just like her, just like us, we're in those same positions. Or jail. I said jail. I'm from Indiana. We get our phonetics. There are a lot of jails in Indiana. That too. Those are my people, Andrea. Those are my people you're messing on. But Jael is this woman who, in a moment, she was presented with an opportunity to do something incredibly bold and take an incredibly bold stance. And she acted with courage and boldness instead of like just stepping back and hoping somebody else would do something. How many times are we faced with a choice between doing something bold or stepping back and hoping somebody else does? Like, you get the point. These women are just like us, right? They were normal women making choices. And so I want us to look at these, to approach these women, to approach our sisters, and see that, again, they weren't just imbued with this special spirituality, but they were women just like us, so that we can approach their stories and glean from it and learn from it and take from it, right? So today we're going to look at two such women. Sisters of ours, I think, that tend to be really elevated, and we forget to see how they were like us and what their struggles must have been. And since we're studying out as a church the book of Luke over the next few months, guess what? I took two women from the book of Luke. Now, you might remember a couple weeks ago, the sermon was about the special role and honor that Luke gives to women. There's something like 23, and I think I'm wrong about this number, but 23 unique instances in the book of Luke where he mentions women that aren't listed anywhere else in the Gospels, right? And another thing that you see Luke doing is he speaks in pairs. So if he speaks about a man, he speaks about a woman. He does this where I wrote this down. In Luke 4, for instance, he heals a man possessed of a demon, and then he heals Peter's mother-in-law. Right? There's that pairing going on. In Luke 7, he heals the centurion's servant, and then he raises the widow of Nain's son back from the dead. Even in parables, he's in Luke 13, a man plants a mustard seed and a woman leavens the dough. There's this intense, it's too specific and intentional to be accidental. He's giving voice to women. He's elevating these people who in the society would have been voiceless. So there we are, Luke, way to be. And I encourage you guys to dive into your Bible and study this out. Really a good quiet time series is read through Luke, and literally every place there's an interaction with a woman or a parable told about a woman, just jot it down and make little notes, and then kind of step back after you've read through it, and you'll see patterns. And the patterns that you see might be different than the patterns that you see, but it's cool when you do things like that. I guarantee you'll see something. You'll walk away more amazed at Jesus's heart for us as women. But today you could open up to Luke 1, because we're just going to look a little bit at Mary and at Elizabeth and how their stories really do intertwine. And we're not just looking at them because they're the first ones that are there, but there's something that I want us to examine, to consider, okay? And our starting point, again, is that they were women just like you and just like me. They were not super holy. They did not have some special holy, secret tunnel that they could get to God with. But they obviously walked with God, right? And they made choices within that walk day by day that made God look at them and say, these two right here, these are the two that I want raising two men that are about to change the world, but they need to be raised by the right women. What was it about them that God saw in them that made him say, these are the ones? Okay, that's what we're going to look at. Because I think if he honors that in them, I want him to look at me and to say, okay, I see that in you. And I want him to be able to use me like that. So that's what we're going to look at. What was it about these two, about how they were? What was it about how they lived that allowed God to use them? And again, it wasn't perfection. Neither of them had arrived. Neither of them was sanctified and holy and done, right? So again, we'll take from them the patterns that we see to look at ourselves and figure out where to go. So Elizabeth is the first one. We're going to start reading in Luke 1, and we're just going to kind of read through and pull out some points. So in Luke 1, verse 5, it says, in the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Okay, so let's stop there and just pull out some points that we see. So first, a few things that these very short verses tell us about our girl Elizabeth. One, she lived under the rule of a cruel and worldly king. We know the stories of Herod, right? As a member of an oppressed people within the Roman Empire. So her people had an appearance of freedom, but they really didn't have the freedom to govern themselves. And the question is, does this factor into our story? Maybe not directly, but I think we need to read the scriptures within context. Again, it fleshes out these people. They were living within a context. They were living within a certain set of circumstances. And our point here is that Elizabeth didn't live in a perfect world. She didn't live in a just world. She didn't live in a verdant society. That's the NPR thing, a just and verdant society. That's not where she lived, just like that's not where we live. So is it applicable? Well, it is in the sense that we find the same unfairness around her that we see with us, right? It takes away our excuse. I think sometimes when we flatten our sisters in the scriptures, we give ourselves excuses to act differently, if that makes sense. So the next thing we see is she was the wife of a priest and she was the daughter of a priest. She was an original PK, if you will. She grew up in one of the priestly cities that were given to the tribe of Levi as, Moses was distributing the promised land. So here we see that she was engrossed in church. Okay, church, really not church, but you know what I'm saying? This was her life. This was her culture. This was her people. But she didn't just know how to act and play a part and appear to be religious. And we know that because it says that she, along with her husband, and this is, if you're single and looking, choose wisely. Choose very, very wisely. But the two of them, the scriptures say they were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit, right? This woman lived her life day in and day out, careful to obey God. Careful to honor God with her life and her choices. Again, wasn't secret special sauce coming down on her. She made choices to be obedient to God. She did all of what God commanded, it says. She didn't choose which parts she was fond of or which parts made sense to her or which parts she felt like doing on the days that she felt good. She observed God's commands, period. Okay? And here's the thing too, it went to the heart. She wasn't just, checking off all the boxes. How do I know that? Because it says she was righteous in the sight of God. God who sees past the facade, past the checked boxes to the heart. That's who she was in God's sight. So God looked at this woman and he saw her walk with him, right? He saw who she was. He knew who she was. He heard her prayers. He saw her struggle. He saw the battle. He saw the grit that was within her. That allowed her to hold to him and to obey regardless of what was going on. And he chose to honor that. What does he see then when he looks at you and I? What is it that he sees in us? Does he see that same grit, right? Does he see that same determination to walk with him, to look to him, to fix our eyes on him, to be obedient to him, whatever happens? Not perfection. He's not looking for perfection. He's not looking for a sinless, mess-free life, because that's not happening. but the grit to hold to him and to fix our eyes to him, whatever is going on around us. That's what he saw in this woman, and that's what he's honoring. And it's funny, I realized long ago, many, many moons ago, young Megan had a revelation. I can never be a perfect Christian. I will never arrive. I think when I was first baptized, I almost thought like, okay, this is the trajectory. You just go from sinful to spiritual all the way up until heaven. 26 years in, there is no trajectory. It's, you know what I mean? It's all over the place. Certain things that I thought, yeah, I'll be done with that by the time I'm 44. No, it's still, and I cannot be a perfect Christian, but I did decide long ago, I can be a faithful disciple. That is completely and totally within my control. I've not yet figured out how to not be afraid. I've not yet figured out how to not, I'm working on those things, but I have figured out, I'll hold on. Come hell or high water, high times, low times, I will hold on. That is completely within my control. That is completely within your control. That was completely within Elizabeth's control. And she was a woman that she just held on, no matter how heartbreaking or hopeless or hopeful or wherever. That's what she did. And that's what God saw. And that's what God honored. We can absolutely do that too, right? The last thing I think that we see here is very illuminating into who she was. She had no children, okay? This mattered to her heart. And this mattered to who she was within her society, the place that she had within her world. This mattered to her husband and his place within the world. The dynamics all around this situation, very, very, very complicated, okay? Easily, this would have been the most bitter, hurtful part of her life, the part that pressed her and threatened her the most. And we're told that they were both very old. So you read, there's no more hope anymore. That ship has sailed. That's not happening, okay? So what I really want to point out in this little thing is you've got these two different realities. You've got Elizabeth living with the greatest hurt and disappointment there was available for a woman of her day. That was her reality. And you have Elizabeth being righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. Just think about that for a second, that those two things are right there in that passage side by side. What does that mean? It means that her obedience, her walk with God, it was not predicated on getting what she wanted. She wasn't in it for the blessings. She wasn't in it for the gifts. She wasn't in it for what you can do for me, and this is what needs to happen. She was in it. She was a righteous woman, not because she had things easy and a blessing-filled life, but she was a righteous woman because she walked with God. Her eyes were fixed on God, not on what she had or didn't have, right? So again, this begs the question for us. It's one of those assaults on the heart from Jesus, like Chris preached about on Sunday. How do your biggest disappointments and hurts, how do they affect your walk with God? How do they affect your obedience with God? Your day in and day out decisions that you make with him. How do you behave when you don't get what you want? We need to think about that. Actually, that's one of spoiler alert, that's going to be one of the D group questions. So you can think about that. But so the story with Elizabeth, it continues on past this point, and she kind of takes she's in the background at this point, because we know, Zechariah, her husband, is on duty. He goes to offer the incense in the temple. The angel shows up and tells him, hey, guess what? God heard your prayers. Well, I'm going to read it. It says in 1:13, don't be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. And implicit in that, Elizabeth's prayers have been heard. Your wife, Elizabeth, will bear you a son, and you're to give him the name John. He'll be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. Wow, what an answer to prayer, right? How many years had they been praying this prayer? How many years had they been asking God? I wonder, were they still praying? I wonder if Elizabeth, after menopause, did she stop praying? Was she like, okay? Did she keep praying? She was Jewish. She was raised on the stories of Sarah and of Hannah, of multiple women in the scriptures begging God for a child, having to wait. But I don't know if she was still praying or not, but I do know that God heard her prayers. And I do know it says, the angel says so. And the proof that God heard her prayers didn't come when John was born. The proof came before John was born, when the angel said, God hears. I just think there's something for us to hold on to there, because sometimes we're looking for the proof that God hears our prayers by having a tangible answer to our prayers. God hears our prayers, okay? Whether or not he's answering, that's a whole other lesson and something to wrestle with. But God heard the prayers of this righteous woman. And of course, then we're familiar with the rest of Zachariah's interaction with this angel. You know, he expressed his doubts that such a thing would happen, as he had a right to do. But then Gabriel confronted this doubt, as he had a right to do, and Zachariah was silent for 9 months. So it's like, whew, okay, here we go. It says in verse 23, then, when his time of service was completed, he returned home. And after this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. The Lord has done this for me, she said. In these days, he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people. Okay, so again, in this little sentence, we can glean a lot about Elizabeth's character here. You know, what we see a lot about her integrity. For all of these years, we find out she had felt the judgment of her people, right? She was disgraced in their eyes, and she felt that. She would have carried that physically on her shoulders, right? She had been wronged, probably, because of the assumptions that people had made about who she was because she couldn't have a child. She was a victim in so many ways in this circumstance. And yet, here was a woman that God said, she's righteous in my eyes. And so, and again, she continued to observe the Lord's commands and decrees, even though she didn't get what she wanted. She was a woman of integrity. She walked with God regardless of what anyone else was saying or doing. And I love it. Look at her heart here. The Lord has done this for me. He has shown his favor. There's no bitterness in this, right? There's no hopelessness. There's no, snarky comments about, well, it was about time because this would have been better when I was younger. I had a lot more energy when I was younger. But like, you don't see there's no subtext there. She's just joyful. She's grateful. She's filled with hope. It was praise freely and fully given to her God, right? And again, remember, she wasn't a perfect woman. She didn't just get there. Like, she was just holy. And so she got there. But I imagine just how many years, how many months of getting her cycle again. How many months, like the hope, maybe this is the month. It's not the month. Maybe this is the month, for years and years and years. Imagine how many hours she spent crying out to God, begging him for this part of her life, begging him to answer these prayers. How long do you think it got her to get to this point where she could receive this gift with just sheer gratitude, without bitterness, without anger, without hopelessness, without an edge, but with just sheer hope? I think, sorry, I'm skipping all of what I'm saying here, but I imagine just time and time again how she had to take her pain and her hurt and decide to stay engaged with God, to keep wrestling with him, to keep giving it to him time and time and time again when it was past all hope. That's how she got there. But are you starting to get an idea of what God saw in this woman that made him say, she's the one that's going to raise John the Baptist? She's the one. I want him growing up within the, under the shadow of her wings. I want her, and she's the mama hen. I want him gathered up close to her because she was a woman of incredible faith, of incredible grit, of incredible integrity, just walking with God. I want to be a woman like Elizabeth. But again, could Elizabeth have been like Elizabeth without the years of pain and struggle and unanswered prayer? It's doubtful, right? Probably those are the years that made Elizabeth, right? I just want to be Elizabeth because God hits me over the head with his wand. And maybe that's where you are in your story. Maybe you're at a place where God is shaping you to be Elizabeth, but you're in the season of silence. You're in the season of unanswered prayer. You're in the season of dashed hope. You're in the season where you're just, but what are you going to do in that season? Are you going to pull back? Are you going to get embittered? Are you going to harden your heart? Are you going to, I won't let you go until you bless me. I'm going to hold on to you no matter what. That's what God saw in this woman. And this is what God can see in us if we make the same choices, right? So we skip ahead a little bit in her story because at this point in the text, a new thread is woven into this tapestry, and we'll pick up that new thread in a second. But this new thread is Elizabeth's relative, Mary, right? And Mary had also just recently received some pretty shocking news about her having a son. I love it because in the angel's talk to Mary, he actually brings up Elizabeth's miracle pregnancy and says nothing is impossible with God. But before we get to Mary's thread, let's round out Elizabeth. So at verse 39, it says, at that time, Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea where she entered Zacharias' home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice, she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her." So, okay, the first thing here, the most obvious thing, Elizabeth is the first human, right, to acknowledge that this little person that's baking in Mary's oven is the Christ, is the long-awaited Messiah. She's the first person to say Jesus is Lord, if you will, you know. She starts prophesying about Jesus and proclaiming him as the long-awaited hope of the Jews and the entire world. And then, again, what further evidence does this interaction that we have between Elizabeth and Mary, what does this tell us about who Elizabeth was? One, I love that it says she exclaimed in a loud voice, right? She was effusive at this point. She was big in her praise. She didn't hold back, you know, she didn't shrink back. She wasn't worried about appearances. She wasn't worried about coming across too strong, but why would she be at this point? After all that's happened, after everything that God has done for her, why would she worry what people think or don't think about her? She wasn't shy about shouting about God and what he was doing in her story, right? But the other thing I also love here is that she had an incredible amount of humility that was on display in this interaction. She wasn't loud and proud, right? She was loud and humble, which is a beautiful combination. I love her words. Why am I so favored that you would come to me, right? Listen, if I'm Elizabeth at this point, that's a great story, Mary. But also, have you heard about what's happening over here? Have you heard about my story? You know, have you heard about my son and the blessing that he's going to be to? Like, if I'm Elizabeth, well, I know why he's coming to me, because I'm kind, you know, like it's easy for me to take that role. But no, she was incredibly humble, and you see it here. And then because she was so humble, she was able to find great joy in Mary's gift and Mary's uniqueness and what God was doing in Mary's story. There's no competition or jealousy there. She was humble. Elizabeth was a humble woman. But then there's a further element to her humility here that comes across. She wasn't falsely humble. Okay. And what do I mean about that? She wasn't like, oh, you know, to God be the glory. I'm just sitting here doing my thing. She's, you know, this line, blessed is she who's believed that the Lord will fulfill his promises to her. It's this incredible acknowledgement that she and Mary, they're playing a pretty large role in this too. They're working together with God in this, you know. It's almost like she's saying, look at us, girl, you know, our fight has paid off. Our grit has paid off. The choices we've made when it was hard, the choices that we made to keep going when there was no answer in sight. God sees it and he's honoring us for it. And we're in partnership with God in this. But I love this. I love this right, I don't know, it's like a humble confidence that she had in the role that she was playing, that God was playing in it. You know, I think about, like, with can I take credit for creating life for my children? I can't take credit for that. God did that, right? But you know what I can take credit? I bore those 5 big-headed Zillmans like a boss. I can take credit for that, right? So I didn't create, like, but there was a role that I got to play together with God doing that. And I love that it's so on display with both Elizabeth and Mary when we look at Mary's song. And that's something sometimes I feel like we're good. I don't know if it's the Protestant in us that's so hesitant to act like we can do anything good for God, but we can't. He wants us to engage with him. He wants us to partner in this with him. And I love it that you see this here in Elizabeth. I want to exude this kind of bold humility that she exuded. And here's the thing, if I overstep and I get on the other side of, like, the bold humility, it's just too bold, don't worry, God will make it clear to me. You know, he'll show me if I need to step back from that. But I love that we see it there. And then Elizabeth's story ends here in verse 57. It says, when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and she said, no, he's to be called John. So at the end of her story, Elizabeth has been given her heart's desire, right? The thing that she's prayed for so long, she's been vindicated by the Lord. Two last things I want to point out about her. Why do you think it tells us, or what do you think it tells us about who she was, that her neighbors and her relatives shared her joy, right? There's no mention of pity. There's no mention of hushed whispers. Wow, did you hear finally after all these years, they finally got it. No, they shared her joy. And the way it's written, it sounds like this, it's this loud, public, out there celebration and this share of joy. Elizabeth didn't keep her neighbors at bay with her bitterness or with her hurt or with how unfair her life was or how things didn't go. There was this is an exclamation point on the fact that this was not an embittered, angry victim who saw this new development as her right. It's about time that this happened for me. No, this was a grateful, obedient, humble, joy-filled woman who walked with God. And because she made those choices, she drew people into the work that God was doing in her life. And again, imagine what it would have been like for John to grow up under this roof, with this to be the influence that he had in his life. You begin to see why God would choose this woman, not because she was perfect, not because she had it all figured out, not because she was, supernaturally spiritual, but because she had this grit to walk with God and to hold to him no matter what. And then the last thing that you see her doing, she's speaking God's word, right? With strength in the face of opposition. She says this, nope, his name's going to be John. And everybody's like, there's no Johns in your family. So they leave and they go to ask Zechariah, and he's like, it's John. But again, there's not a bitterness, a grudge, but she powerfully speaks the truth that God spoke to her. I love it. In the face of just, the hush up, she's still radiant, she's joyful, and she's unapologetic about the message that God has given her and through her. What an incredible woman, right? We're not going to spend nearly as much time looking at Mary, but we're going to pick up her thread because we're much more familiar with Mary's story, right? People that don't know the Bible are familiar with Mary's story. But just a few little things that we'll point out. I think one, it's interesting to me to note that Luke's picture of Mary is much more dynamic than Matthew's picture of Mary, right? Matthew's isn't wrong at all, but it tells the story from a different vantage point. And so in his story, Mary's honestly more kind of like this starry-eyed, just kind of this passive, something is happening to her, okay? She doesn't really have any true agency in it. But in Luke's account of Mary, I love it because Mary actually begins to emerge. You actually begin to see who she is and what she was like. And again, she wasn't this, starry-eyed passive girl. She was a spitfire, okay? She had grit and she had gumption, even from a young age. One of my favorite passages where I see that Mary is a real woman, okay, just like us, is in John 2. You don't have to turn there, but it's the one where it says, on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Now, take note about what's about to come. You see how real this woman was. So it says, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. And what does Jesus say? Woman, why do you involve me? He replies, my hour has not yet come. So you imagine Mary sitting here listening to that. And then what does it say she does next? She says to the servants, hey, do whatever he says. It's almost like she's saying, this is such a mom moment where she was like, Jesus is like, no, I'm not doing anything. And Mary's like, okay, hey, can you guys listen to what he's about to tell you how to do? I love that story. This is a real woman, right? And I even, why is that detail even included? The gospel does not hinge on us knowing that little story, right? Even Jesus's first miracle could have gone without Mary's presence in it. But I can only imagine how many times Mary and John, as time went on, Jesus, even how many times they laughed about this story, how many times they laughed about that interaction of Mary just being a mom, being a human mom. She was a spitfire. And back in Luke, then it says in 1:26, in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, greetings, you who are highly favored, the Lord is with you. Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. So again, okay, we're very familiar with this story, right? But Mary is a small town Jewish girl 2,000 years ago about to get married. She's on a very typical path for someone in her station. But what's not so typical is an angel shows up at her house. Number one. And then number two, the angel tells her she is highly favored, presumably by God. That's kind of implicit in it, right? So we get our first glimpse into why God might have chosen her to raise his son, even in her response to this angel visiting. It says she was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. What does this say about Mary? It says that our girl was shrewd. Okay, she wasn't dumb. she knew what was going on. She was insightful. She was clearly well-versed in the scriptures, right? She knew the stories, and she knew that when angels showed up in your life, things were about to change. Something was going to be different. And so she was responding to that. I love that she didn't try to hide it. I love that she didn't, get really holy and try to pretend like, okay, whatever. But she was troubled, and she didn't try to hide it. There was no faking. She wasn't trying to be zen on the outside and panicked on the inside. She knew something was about to happen, and she was afraid. So afraid that the angel sees it. He recognizes her distress, and he says to her in verse 30, "Don't be afraid, Mary. You found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you're to call him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." Okay. "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I'm a virgin?" Okay. Again, a tiny little sentence tells us a lot about who she is, about what her character is. What this says is that Mary is not afraid to engage. She wasn't too timid to ask the obvious question, right? To address the massive elephant that was in the room. Even to ask the angel Gabriel this question. Again, there's a side of it that I think I might be so overwhelmed and shell-shocked. Okay, how am I supposed to behave in this scenario that I'm worried about all the wrong things? She just engaged, honestly. This is what's on my heart. This is what's on my mind. So this is what is coming out to you, God, right? She knew how to engage. This was a young woman without guile. And she wasn't trying to pretend that she was cool with something that she wasn't. But she also didn't run and hide, right? She stays engaged. This was a woman who you can tell, and she was young. Some people think she was 13, 14, 15, right? She was young, but you could tell she was already used to dialoguing with her God. She knew what it was to be in relationship with God. She was used to a back and forth. Otherwise, in the face of an angel coming down, you don't just sit there and have a conversation. Right? She was already used to the back and forth. She was real, and she was honest with God. And she asked an incredibly reasonable question, right? A question that she felt the freedom to ask her God because she had a relationship with him. Not just this holy transactional, okay, I just behave and do what you got to do, Mary, but an honest relationship. And that's immediate. That's what you see in her. That's what God saw in her. And then it's funny because the angel answers, "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you." And so in response to her sincere question, she kind of got an answer. Again, if I'm her, there's still way more ambiguity than what I want. Like, I'm going to need to know some more details about how all of this is going to work. But then what is her response in this? In verse 38, "I'm the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May your word to me be fulfilled." And then it says the angel leaves her. So here's the thing. Not only was Mary a woman who clearly walked with God and who knew him, but look at how she viewed herself in relationship to him, in relation to him. "I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said." Again, I am the Lord's servant. We could spend the entire night camping on that phrase. I think we can all admit that this was a huge ask on God's part. Okay, this was big. I feel like God has had some huge asks on my part. No, I have nothing like this, right? Did Mary have a choice in the matter, do you think? It's debated. I 100% think she did. Because I think God gives us choice. God gives us agency. God gives us the ability to make our choices. Well, regardless of whether or not she had a choice, I guess it's a moot point. She did choose. She agrees to do this. How? The only way she's going to be able to make that choice is if that really is her mindset. I'm the Lord's servant. I use this analogy all the time. But what happens when I see myself primarily as Megan? I usually have this get a little name tag, hello, my name is, and then you write your name on there, right? When I'm Megan and I'm presenting as Megan and my main concern is Megan, what happens? Well, I'm my own woman, right? And I've got my own life and my own choices to make and my own path I need to take. And then I begin to fight for her, for this woman, for Megan, to choose what is best for her, to be guided by what she wants and what's going to be best for her outcome, to build up her kingdom, right? If Mary was primarily concerned with Mary, this decision, okay, I'll bear the Son of God and I'll raise him. That would have been a terrible choice. That was not good for her bottom line if she's trying to build her own kingdom. But let me ask you this. Do you think when all was said and done, do you think Mary would have said yes again? I think so too. I think about stuff like that a lot. Do I think that she might have questioned the decision at points along the way? Absolutely. Unequivocally. How could you not? At so many different points, how could you not God, you didn't explain this fully to me. Remember when I asked you, you gave me a little explanation and I needed more because I feel like I made an uninformed decision. There would have been so many points where she would have paused and questioned, did I make the right choice? But do I think that she regretted her decision? I don't. In the long view, when you look at her entire story, the entire story, I don't think that she regretted it. And do I think that she would do it again? I do. So what does this mean for us, right? What does this mean? What does my life look like? What does your life look like if you choose to identify primarily as the Lord's servant? Before you and who you are and what rights you have as an individual, what if you choose to identify primarily, I am the Lord's servant. Let it be to me as you have said. What does your life look like at that point? Does it look the same as it does now? Does it look different than it does now? We can ask Mary. Her song of praise in 46, it says, my soul glorifies the Lord and my spirit rejoices in God, my Father, for he's been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the mighty one has done great things for me. Holy is his name. And she goes on with this incredible prayer that is still, what's it called? The Magnificat? Did anybody grow up Catholic? Magnificat? Okay, thank you. Cindy Featherman for the win. I knew she'd know. She's a scholar. This prayer that she prayed is still prayed thousands of years later, right? It's still sung thousands of years later. So I think, did Mary regret her choice? No. This was the completion and the fulfillment of her story. And again, we don't have time to dive into that passage, but that's another good quiet time to study that out, to dissect it. Actually, write it out and see what you see about her faith and her grit and the mindset she had in that, and then how God met that faith and how he met that grit, how he met a sinful, broken woman, but what he did with her story, in spite of her and because of her, both, right? All wrapped up. How did he use this woman? And again, let's ask ourselves, what did God see in her that made him want to entrust his son to her household? What did he see in her? What did he see in Elizabeth? And we'll finish here, but what about you, right? What does passages like this always make me stop and think and reflect? What does he see in me? What does he see that he's like, yes? And what did he see that he's like, no? I know the things that he sees as no, because he's working hard. He's working overtime this year to shake it out of me, to refine it out of me. But what does he see in you? Does he see the same grit and honesty and genuine relationship that these women had with him? Does he see a righteous woman just faithfully fighting to observe his commands, to be obedient to him, whatever is going on in life? Does he see you there? And here's the thing, guys, if that answer to that question feels discouraging, if when I ask that and you thought about that, you're immediately like, it's just time for bed. There's hope. That's why we have Jesus. He's here to help us. But what we have to do is we have to want it. We have to want to be a woman like that. We have to desire to live a life like that. And then we have to open the door. I want this, God. Help me to get there. Help me to do that. We can all be. The point is, we can all be like these two women were. We can all live such lives. And And just the final observation here as we close, these two women, they were pretty remarkable on their own, right? As these two individuals just striving to honor God with their ordinary lives. But did you notice what happened when the two came together? I mean, babies were leaping in the wombs, prophecy was happening, songs were being written. Like, it was just this explosion of just spiritual, like, power going on, because two spiritual women together, boy, what a difference it made. Again, we don't have time to explore and really dive into what their friendship was and what spiritual godly friendships look like on either side. But that's how God designed us, right? So just look around, look at one another. In an awkward moment, seriously, look at one another. I know, like, again, I say, look at one. If you're on there, look at the little boxes, scan through, and look at the faces, right, of one another. This is what we're all godly women here. We're all trying to do this, right? But let's look at one another and see one another and engage with one another in the way that these two spiritual women engaged with one another and helped lift one another's eyes up and allowed for this explosion of creative spirituality. We're much better together than we are as individuals. So you look at Mary's story, wow. You look at Elizabeth's story, wow. But neither woman was in a vacuum. Both women were in a context of community and connection and relationship. And that really is how God is going to lift us up and spur one another on. So what we're going to do right now is just split up, okay? Into our little groups for about, it's 8 o'clock, so probably like 15 to 17 minutes, okay? Here are the questions. Okay, they are here. I was like, did I leave them somewhere else? Here's some questions for us to talk about. And again, we're ladies, so if you don't even get around to any of these questions, you know, it's okay. Like, don't panic. You don't have to move through all. Like, I could just say, okay, talk. And for most of us, we could. But so a couple questions to ask. Here's the pedestrian. Here's the soft lob up the middle. Okay, for you. What most strikes you about Elizabeth and or Mary? What most stands out to you about these two women? Okay, talk about that for a second. And then the next question, how do your circumstances affect your walk with God and your obedience? What does that look like for you? So how do your circumstances affect your walk with God and your obedience? Okay. And then the last question, this is worded poorly. I'm just going to tell you that right now, but are you actively participating in relationships with other godly women? And that's a yes or no question. So then I added, you know, a second question to it and made it ungainly. But what motivates you or demotivates you to interact with other spiritual women? That's the way we'll put it, okay? What motivates you or demotivates you to act within these relationships with other spiritual women, okay? So that's what we're gonna do. So online, are you good, Sydney, for getting them in their room? Okay, sweet. So you guys are about to go, and then you guys in here, and then we'll come back in here and just say a final prayer together. So come back for a prayer. So us in here, go ahead and just split up into little groups of ladies. Little groups of ladies.